Imagine this. December 1943, Long Beach, California, a factory where the air smells like motor oil and hot metal. Workers in coveralls are finishing up another P-51 Mustang, one of the most advanced fighter planes in the world. Silver fuselage gleaming under the factory lights. The engine has been tested. The instruments calibrated. The fuel tanks topped off. This plane is headed to Newark, New Jersey. From there, it'll be loaded onto a cargo ship bound for England. There, it'll join American squadrons fighting the Luftwaffe over Europe. But first, someone has to fly it across the country. 2,000 miles. California to New Jersey. Over deserts. Over mountains. Over the Great Plains. Solo. No co-pilot. No navigator. No radio contact with the ground for most of the trip. Just a map, a compass, and skill. Picture this scene. A young woman walks across the tarmac. Mid-20s. 5'4", maybe 120 pounds soaking wet. She's wearing a leather flight jacket, goggles pushed up on her forehead, and a smile that suggests she's about to do something she loves. She climbs into the cockpit, straps herself in, runs through the pre-flight checklist, flips switches. The Merlin engine roars to life. The propeller spins. The plane shudders with power. 60 seconds later, she's airborne. The California coastline drops away beneath her. She banks east, 2,000 miles ahead of her. 3 or 4 days of flying if the weather holds. If nothing breaks. If she doesn't get lost. Now here's the part that should absolutely blow your mind. This woman? She's not in the military. She has no rank, no official uniform, no serial number. She's a civilian contractor. And here's what makes this even more remarkable. If something goes wrong on this flight, if the engine quits over the Rockies or she flies into a storm over Kansas and crashes, the United States Army will not pay to send her body home. Her fellow pilots will have to pass a hat around, collect donations, scrape together enough money to buy a train ticket and a pine coffin so her family can bury her. And yet, by the time World War II ends, she and roughly 1,100 women, just like her, will have flown over 60 million miles. 60 million miles. Stop and think about that number for a moment. That number is so big it's almost meaningless until you break it down. That's enough distance to circle the Earth at the equator 2,400 times. That's 125 round trips to the moon. That's more than most commercial airline pilots will fly in their entire 30-year careers. Here's what these women actually did. These women flew 78 different types of military aircraft. Not just trainers. Not just light cargo planes. They flew fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, aircraft that could reach 400 miles per hour, aircraft with 4 engines that weighed 30 tons fully loaded, aircraft that had a reputation for taking pilots' lives, male or female. They ferried brand new planes from factories to bases. They tested aircraft that had been damaged in combat, repaired, and needed someone to make sure the repairs actually worked. They towed targets for live gunnery practice. This meant men with real bullets and real anti-aircraft guns shot at fabric banners trailing behind their planes. Sometimes those men missed the banners and hit the planes instead. 38 of these women lost their lives doing this work. 38. Engine failures, mid-air collisions, weather, mechanical malfunctions, crashes on takeoff or landing. And here's the part that should make you angry. Every single time one of them perished, there was no military funeral, no flag-draped coffin, no telegram from the War Department, just a letter from their fellow pilots, and a collection to pay for the funeral. For 33 years after World War II ended, the United States government refused to officially recognize that these women had served at all. 33 years. From 1944 to 1977, the government's position was simple. These women were civilian contractors who'd flown some planes during the war, and that was it. No veteran status, no benefits, no acknowledgement of their sacrifice. So let me ask you something. Who were these women? How did a group of female civilian pilots end up flying some of the most dangerous missions of World War II? Why did they do it? And why did America spend 3 decades trying to forget them? This is the story of the Women Airforce Service Pilots, the WASP, the women who flew 60 million miles in the shadows. They broke every barrier the military establishment could throw at them. They faced discrimination and skepticism at every turn. They lost 38 of their sisters, and they changed the course of aviation history forever. Let's go behind the scenes. The story of the WASP doesn't start in 1941 with Pearl Harbor. It doesn't start in 1942 when the program officially launched. It starts decades earlier. Because here's something you might not know. Women flying airplanes wasn't some radical new concept dreamed up during World War II. Women had been in the sky since the 1700s. 1784. Lyon, France. A woman named Marie Elizabeth Abel climbed into a hot air balloon and became the first woman in recorded history to fly. She ascended over the city dressed in an elaborate gown while a crowd of thousands watched from below. The balloon rose to 8,500 feet. The Abel stayed aloft for 45 minutes. When she landed, she'd proven something that many men at the time doubted. Women could fly. Over the next 150 years, women kept proving it. Again and again and again. Every decade brought new pioneers, new records, new proof that women belonged in the sky. 1893, Chicago World's Fair. A German woman named Kathy Paulus became one of the first female professional parachutists. She made exhibition jumps that drew massive crowds. 1903, the Wright brothers made the first powered flight at Kitty Hawk. Within a decade, women were flying airplanes. 1910, Raymond de la Roche of France became the first woman in the world to earn a pilot's license. Just 10 years later, more than 200 women in the United States alone held pilot licenses. 1915, in the middle of World War I, a French woman named Marie Marvin didn't just fly. She flew combat missions. She volunteered to pilot bombing runs over German-held territory in France. She actually bombed a German military base in Metz. For that mission and others, the French government awarded her the Croix de Guerre. That's one of France's highest military honors. Think about that for a second. A woman flying combat missions in 1915, over a century ago, dropping bombs on enemy targets, earning medals for valor. And yet, consider this. 30 years later, when World War II broke out, the American military establishment acted like the idea of women flying military aircraft was completely unprecedented and probably impossible. The 1920s and 30s were the golden age of aviation. Barnstormers and air racers crisscrossed the country. They performed stunts and set records. And women were right there alongside the men. 1928. Amelia Earhart became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean as a passenger. A year later, she did it again, this time as the pilot. In 1932, she became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. In 1935, she became the first person, male or female, to fly solo from Hawaii to California. Earhart wasn't alone. There were dozens, eventually hundreds, of skilled female pilots in America by the 1930s. Women like Jacqueline Cochran, Ruth Nichols, Louise Thaden, Blanche Noyes, Helen Ritchie, Nancy Harkness, and many others. They competed in air races. They set speed and altitude records. They worked as flight instructors, test pilots, and air show performers. In 1929, 99 of these women got together and formed an organization. They called it the 99's International Organization of Women Pilots. The name came from the fact that there were exactly 99 charter members. Amelia Earhart was elected as the first president. The goal of the organization was simple: support women in aviation, share knowledge, advocate for more opportunities. By 1940, there were more than 3,000 licensed female pilots in the United States. 3,000 women who knew how to handle a stick and rudder. Women with hundreds or even thousands of flight hours. Women who could fly in bad weather, navigate by instruments, handle emergencies. Now, here's the twist. And the military wanted absolutely nothing to do with them. The United States Army Air Corps, which would become the Army Air Forces in 1941, had a firm policy. No women. Women could work as nurses. They could work in administrative roles. They could rivet airplane parts in factories. But they could not fly military aircraft. The official position was clear. Women lacked the physical strength, the mental toughness, the emotional stability, and the technical skill required to be military pilots. Never mind that women had been flying for decades. Never mind that women had set altitude records and speed records. These records rivaled or exceeded those set by men. Never mind that women had proven themselves in air races against male competitors. The military didn't care. No women in the cockpit. End of discussion. But here's where things get interesting. Two women weren't willing to take no for an answer. Two women who would eventually become the architects of the WASP program. Two women whose persistence, skill, and connections would eventually crack open a door. A door that the military had kept locked for decades. Their names were Jacqueline Cochran and Nancy Harkness Love. Let me tell you about Jackie first. Jacqueline Cochran was born Bessie Lee Pittman sometime around 1906 or 1910 in Muskogee, Florida. The exact date is disputed. Her gravestone says 1906. Air Force records say 1910. Jackie herself gave different dates at different times in her life. What's not disputed is that her childhood was extremely harsh. She grew up in crushing poverty. Her family moved constantly from one lumber mill town to another. They traveled across Florida, Georgia, and Alabama, chasing work that paid pennies. By the time Jackie was 8 years old, she was working 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, in a cotton mill in Columbus, Georgia. She earned 6 cents an hour. Now get this. With her first paycheck, 8-year-old Jackie bought the first pair of shoes she'd ever owned. They were high heels. She wore them to work at the mill. By age 9, Jackie had dropped out of school to work full-time. She supervised other child workers at the mill. By age 10, she'd moved on to a new job working for a family that owned beauty salons. She learned how to cut hair, make wigs, give permanents. At 14, Jackie married a man named Robert Cochran and had a child with him. At 15, she left both of them behind. She moved to Montgomery, Alabama. She took a job at a beauty salon. She never looked back. Her son passed away a few years later. She divorced her husband. She kept the last name Cochran. In her late teens and early 20s, Jackie taught herself nursing and worked for a country doctor in Florida. Then she went back to the beauty industry. By 1929, at roughly age 23, she'd made her way to New York City. She landed a job at a Saks Fifth Avenue salon. She was beautiful, charismatic, ambitious, and absolutely determined to become someone important. In 1932, while working in Miami during the winter season, Jackie attended a dinner party. There she met a man named Floyd Odlum. Odlum was one of the wealthiest men in America. Self-made millionaire, financier, investor. He'd made a fortune during the Great Depression by buying up undervalued companies and turning them around. Jackie told Odlum about her dream of starting her own cosmetics company. She wanted to travel around the country, selling products, building a brand. Odlum looked at her and said something that changed her life. He said she would need wings to cover that much ground that quickly. Here's where it gets incredible. Jackie took it literally. Within weeks, she'd signed up for flying lessons. 3 weeks later, she had her pilot's license. 3 weeks. Most people took months to get their license. Jackie did it in 21 days. She was a natural. Within a year, she was entering air races. Within 2 years, she was setting records. She had an instinct for flying. She could push an aircraft to its limits without crossing the line into recklessness. In 1936, she married Floyd Odlum. He bankrolled her flying career and her cosmetics business, Jacqueline Cochran Incorporated. She marketed it under the slogan Wings to Beauty. She became rich. She became famous. She flew faster and higher than almost any woman alive. In 1938, Jackie won the Bendix Trophy. That's one of the most prestigious transcontinental air races in America. She was the first woman to win it. She flew from Los Angeles to Cleveland in 8 hours, 10 minutes, and 31 seconds. She beat male competitors. By 1940, Jacqueline Cochran held more speed, distance, and altitude records than any other female pilot in the world. She'd set records in 17 different aircraft types. She was internationally famous. Newspapers called her the greatest woman pilot in history. And she had connections. Her husband Floyd Odlum knew everyone. Military leaders, politicians, businessmen. Through him, Jackie had direct access to General Henry Hap Arnold. He was the commanding general of the Army Air Forces. Jackie Cochran was brash, confident, and ambitious. She knew she was good. She knew women could fly as well as men. And she was determined to prove it on the biggest stage possible. Now let me introduce you to Nancy. Nancy Harkness Love was Jackie Cochran's opposite in almost every way. Where Jackie came from poverty, Nancy came from privilege. Where Jackie was self-taught and scrappy, Nancy was educated and methodical. Where Jackie was loud and attention-seeking, Nancy was quiet and professional. Hannah Lincoln Harkness, who went by Nancy, was born on February 14, 1914, in Houghton, Michigan. Her father, Dr. Robert Harkness, was a prominent physician. Her mother, Alice Shadurn, came from a wealthy New England family. Nancy grew up with money, education, and opportunities. In 1927, when Nancy was 13, she watched newsreel footage of Charles Lindbergh. The footage showed him landing the Spirit of St. Louis in Paris after completing the first solo transatlantic flight. She was transfixed. She told her parents she wanted to learn to fly. A few years later, a barnstormer came through Houghton offering plane rides for $5. Nancy begged her parents to let her go up. They reluctantly agreed. She was 16 years old. And here's the moment everything changed for her. The moment the plane left the ground, Nancy knew flying was what she wanted to do for the rest of her life. Despite her parents' objections, Nancy convinced them to pay for flying lessons. 1 month later, at age 16, she had her pilot's license. Nancy enrolled at Vassar College, one of the most prestigious women's colleges in America. She studied languages and history, but her real passion was flying. She spent every free moment at the local airport. She flew whenever she could. By the time she graduated from Vassar in 1935, she had over 500 flight hours. In 1936, Nancy married Robert N. Love, an Army Air Corps Reserve Major. Together, they started an aviation company called Intercity Aviation in Boston. Nancy worked as a pilot. She flew passengers and cargo around the Northeast. She also worked as a test pilot. In 1937 and 1938, Nancy tested experimental aircraft modifications for the Gwin Air Car Company. She worked alongside Frank Cox, one of the most famous air racers of the era. She tested new tricycle landing gear designs. These designs would eventually become standard on most aircraft. She tested navigation equipment. She flew planes that hadn't been fully proven safe. She documented performance and identified problems. Nancy competed in air races in 1936 and 1937. This included the national air races in Los Angeles and Detroit. She finished second in Detroit and then retired from racing. She'd proven she could compete. That was enough. She didn't need the spotlight. By 1940, Nancy Harkness Love had thousands of flight hours. She had experience in dozens of aircraft types. She had a reputation as one of the most skilled pilots in the country. She was calm under pressure, technically brilliant, a natural leader. And like Jackie Cochran, she believed women could serve their country by flying military aircraft. So here's what Nancy did. In 1940, Nancy approached the Army Air Corps with a proposal. Let women ferry aircraft from factories to military bases. It was a simple, logical idea. The Air Corps needed pilots. Women were available. Why not use them? The Air Corps said no. Absolutely not. Women weren't strong enough, weren't trained enough. It wouldn't work. Nancy filed the proposal away and waited. She had a feeling the military's position would change. She just needed the right moment. And that moment? That moment came on December 7th, 1941. December 7th, 1941. 7:55 in the morning, Honolulu time. The first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over Pearl Harbor. 183 planes. Fighters. Dive bombers. Torpedo bombers. They came in from the north over the mountains. They descended on the naval base and the surrounding airfields. At the same time, about 3 miles away, a young woman named Cornelia Fort was giving a flying lesson to a student in a small Piper Cub. They were practicing touch-and-go landings at John Rogers Airport on Oahu. Cornelia was 22 years old. She'd grown up in Nashville, Tennessee, daughter of a wealthy physician. She'd learned to fly at Sarah Lawrence College. She'd moved to Hawaii in 1941 to work as a civilian flight instructor for the Army. Now picture this moment. That morning, she was sitting in the back seat of the Piper Cub while her student handled the controls in the front. They were approaching the runway for another practice landing. Then Cornelia looked up and saw an aircraft diving straight at them. She grabbed the controls and jerked the Piper Cub into a steep climb. The other aircraft, a military plane with a red circle painted on its wings, roared past them, so close that Cornelia could see the pilot's face. Her first thought was that some Army pilot was being incredibly reckless. Then she looked toward Pearl Harbor and saw the explosions, saw the smoke, saw aircraft with red circles on their wings strafing the harbor and the airfields. Here's something remarkable. Cornelia Fort became the first American pilot, male or female, to encounter Japanese aircraft on December 7th, 1941. She managed to land the Piper Cub safely. She and her student ran for cover. And as Cornelia watched what happened next, she made a critical decision. She watched the Japanese planes tear through the American naval fleet. She watched them destroy dozens of aircraft on the ground. She decided she was going to find a way to help her country. She was going to use her skills as a pilot to serve. The attack on Pearl Harbor lasted less than 2 hours. When it was over, 2,400 Americans had lost their lives. Another 1,100 were wounded. 8 battleships had been damaged or destroyed. 347 aircraft had been destroyed or damaged. And the United States was at war. Within days, everything changed. Congress declared war on Japan, then on Germany and Italy. Suddenly, America was fighting a two-ocean war against multiple enemies simultaneously. Now here's the problem the military faced. The Army Air Forces had a massive, urgent problem. They needed pilots. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands of them. Before Pearl Harbor, the Army Air Corps had about 26,000 pilots total. That number needed to grow to at least 100,000, maybe more, as quickly as possible. The military needed pilots for combat missions over Europe and the Pacific. Pilots for bomber crews. Pilots for fighter squadrons. Pilots for transport operations. Pilots for reconnaissance. But they also needed pilots for all the unglamorous, non-combat work that had to happen stateside. Ferrying new aircraft from factories to bases. Testing repaired aircraft. Tilling targets for gunnery practice. Training new pilots. Administrative flights. Before the war, male pilots handled all of that. But now consider this challenge. Every male pilot who was ferrying a plane from California to Texas was one less pilot available for combat duty overseas. The math didn't work. There weren't enough men to do both. In early 1942, Nancy Harkness Love pulled out the proposal she'd filed away in 1940. She updated it, refined it, and sent it to Colonel William H. Tunner. He was the commander of the ferrying division of the Army Air Forces Air Transport Command. Love's proposal was straightforward. Recruit experienced female pilots. Put them to work ferrying aircraft from factories to bases within the United States. Free up male pilots for combat duty overseas. Simple, logical, efficient. Tunner loved it. He forwarded the proposal up the chain of command with his full endorsement. Meanwhile, Jackie Cochran was pushing her own plan. She'd been pushing it since before Pearl Harbor. She'd already flown to England in 1941. She'd met with British officials about their air transport auxiliary. That was a civilian organization that used female pilots to ferry aircraft. She'd even recruited 25 American women to go to England and fly for the British. Now she was back in the United States. She was lobbying General Hap Arnold directly. Her proposal was more ambitious than Nancy Love's. She wanted to create a full training program for women pilots. Not just recruit women who were already experienced, but train new pilots from scratch. Build a pipeline that could produce hundreds of female pilots. Arnold listened to both proposals. And in a move that would create tension for years, here's what he did. He approved both. In September of 1942, Nancy Harkness Love was authorized to create the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, known as the WFS. Her mission was to recruit and deploy experienced female pilots for ferry duty immediately. At the same time, Jackie Cochran was put in charge of the Women's Flying Training Detachment. They called it the WFTD. Her mission was to create a training program that would turn women with basic flying skills into military-qualified pilots. 2 programs, 2 leaders, 2 very different approaches. It was messy. It created confusion. It created rivalry. But it worked. Watch how quickly Nancy moved. Nancy Love moved fast. Within days of getting approval, she started sending telegrams to every highly qualified female pilot she knew. She needed women who already had at least 500 hours of flight time and a commercial pilot's license. Women who could step into a military aircraft and fly it competently from day one. The telegrams were brief. They said something like this: the Army Air Forces needs experienced women pilots for ferry duty. Interested? Report to Newcastle Army Air Base in Wilmington, Delaware. Out of the hundreds of women Nancy contacted, 28 responded and met the qualifications. 28 women. That was the original WFS. the first female pilots officially recruited to fly for the United States military. Betty Hewler-Gillies was the first to arrive at Newcastle. She was 33 years old, married with 2 children, and one of the most experienced pilots in America. She'd been flying since 1928. She'd competed in air races against men and held multiple speed records. She'd flown everything from light sport planes to heavy transports. Betty became the squadron leader. She was the first woman to officially command a unit of female military pilots in American history. Teresa James was number 8 to arrive. She was 31 years old from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She'd learned to fly during the Great Depression. She worked odd jobs to pay for lessons. By 1935, she was a barnstorming stunt pilot. She performed at county fairs and air shows across the Midwest. She'd flown upside down, done loop-the-loops, executed 26.5 consecutive tail spins. She had nerves of steel and thousands of hours of experience. Remember Cornelia Fort? Cornelia Fort, the woman who'd been in the air over Pearl Harbor, was number 10. She'd made her way back from Hawaii to the mainland. She immediately applied when she heard about Nancy Love's program. She wanted to serve. She wanted to fly. The WFS gave her that chance. These 28 women reported to Newcastle Army Air Base in September and October of 1942. They were issued unofficial uniforms that they had to pay for themselves. They were sworn in as civilian employees of the Army Air Forces. They were given an orientation on military procedures and aircraft. And then they went to work. Their first assignment was to ferry PT-19 primary trainers from the Fairchild factory in Hagerstown, Maryland, to military training bases across the East Coast and South. The PT-19 was a simple, 2-seat, open cockpit trainer. Top speed about 100 miles per hour. Easy to handle. Perfect for new pilots learning the basics. The WFS ferried dozens of them. Then they moved on to bigger aircraft. The AT-6 Texan Advanced Trainer. The L for Piper Cub Liaison Aircraft. The UC-78 Bamboo Bomber Twin-Engine Trainer. Every plane they ferried was one less ferry mission a male pilot had to fly, which meant one more male pilot available for combat duty. The WFS proved themselves immediately. They flew safely. They flew efficiently. They didn't complain. They didn't cause problems. They just did the job. Within months, Nancy Love was asking for permission to train her WFS on fighter aircraft. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-51 Mustang, the big, powerful, single-seat fighters that were pouring out of American factories by the hundreds. The military brass was skeptical. Fighters were complicated, heavy, powerful. Could women really handle them? Nancy Love and Betty Gillies said yes. Absolutely. Give us a chance to prove it. In early 1943, several WFS pilots were checked out on the P-47 Thunderbolt. This was the largest, heaviest single-seat fighter aircraft America had ever built. It weighed 7 tons empty. It had a 2,000 horsepower engine. It could fly at over 400 miles per hour. Male pilots called it the Jug because it looked like a milk jug with wings. Now imagine what Teresa James felt. Teresa James was one of the first 3 women to fly the P-47. She was anxious. She climbed into the cockpit, which was tiny compared to the massive fuselage. She ran through the checklist, started the engine. The whole plane vibrated. She taxied out to the runway, took a deep breath, and opened the throttle. The P-47 roared down the runway and lifted into the sky. Teresa climbed to altitude, leveled off, and realized she was grinning. The plane was incredible, powerful, responsive. Yes, it was big. Yes, it was heavy, but it flew beautifully. She landed it safely. And from that moment on, The WFS were cleared to ferry fighter aircraft. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, Jackie Cochran was building her training program. Cochran's WFDD started out at the Houston Municipal Airport in Texas in November of 1942. The first class had 28 trainees, the same number as the original WFS. But Cochran's vision was much bigger. She wanted to train hundreds of women, maybe thousands. The training program was rigorous. Ground school covering navigation, meteorology, mechanics, and radio communications. Physical fitness training. Hours and hours of flight time and trainers. Check rides with Army instructors. The first class graduated in April of 1943. They were assigned to bases around the country for ferry duty, just like the WFS. But the Houston facility was too small. Cochran needed more space, more runways, more aircraft, more room for expansion. In July of 1943, the entire WFDD training operation moved to Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. Avenger Field would become the heart and soul of the WASP program. Every woman who became a WASP after July 1943 trained at Sweetwater. It was the only all-female military pilot training base in American history. And then came the big moment. On August 5, 1943, the WFS and WFDD officially merged into one organization, the Women Airforce Service Pilots, WASP. Nancy Love's original group of experienced pilots became part of the larger WASP program. Jackie Cochran was named director of all WASP operations, and the training pipeline at Avenger Field became the standard entry point for new recruits. From that moment on, if a woman wanted to become a WASP, she had to go through Sweetwater. Sweetwater, Texas. Population 5,000. 40 miles west of Abilene. Middle of nowhere. Flat. Dry. Hot. Summer temperatures that regularly topped 100 degrees. Wind that could knock a person sideways. Dust that got into everything. Clothes. Hair. Eyes. Food. Now imagine training to fly military aircraft in this environment. This was where the Women Airforce Service Pilots trained. Avenger Field had opened in 1942 as a civilian flight school operated by the Army. By 1943, the Army had converted it into the WFDD Training Center. The base covered about 2,200 acres. It had 3 concrete runways laid out in a triangle pattern, dozens of hangars, barracks, a mess hall, classrooms, a control tower. Between July of 1943 and December of 1944, 18 classes of women went through pilot training at Avenger Field. 25,000 women applied to the program. Let that number sink in for a moment. 25,000 women wanted to be WASP. They came from every state, every background. Farm girls who'd learned to fly crop dusters in the Midwest. College graduates from the East Coast. Daughters of wealthy families who'd taken flying lessons as a hobby. Flight instructors. Mechanics. Women who'd spent years saving money for flying lessons because they loved being in the air. But the WASP had strict requirements. Applicants had to be between 18 and 35 years old. Some women lied about their age to get in. They needed at least 2 years of college or the equivalent work experience. They had to be at least 5 feet tall, later raised to 5 feet 4. They needed a pilot's license with at least 35 hours of logged flight time. And they had to pass a rigorous physical exam and a personal interview. Out of 25,000 applicants, only 1,830 were accepted into the program. And of those 1,830 who started training, only 1,102 graduated. Think about what that means. That's a 40% washout rate. For out of every 10 women who started training didn't finish. Some washed out because they failed check rides. Some couldn't handle the physical demands. Some got homesick. Some got injured. Some just realized flying military aircraft wasn't for them. The WASP training program was harder than most male pilot training programs at the time. The standards were higher, the scrutiny more intense. Here's why. Because everyone knew that if the women failed, if the program collapsed, it would be decades before women got another chance at military aviation. So the women who made it through were extraordinary. They were some of the most skilled, determined, resilient pilots in the country, male or female. Training started the moment a new class arrived at Sweetwater. The women lived in barracks on the base. 6 women per bay, metal bunk beds, thin mattresses, footlockers for personal belongings. No privacy, no luxury, just the basics. Reveille at 6 in the morning. The women had 30 minutes to shower, dress in their flight suits, and make their beds to military standards. Hospital corners. No wrinkles. If an instructor could bounce a quarter off a bed, it was made correctly. If not, the woman got written up. After inspection, they marched to the mess hall for breakfast. Eggs, bacon, toast, oatmeal, coffee. The food was plain but plentiful. The women needed the calories. They were about to spend the next 12 to 14 hours working their bodies and minds to exhaustion. After breakfast, they marched to ground school, classes in navigation, meteorology, aircraft recognition, mechanics, radio communications, Morse code, military protocol. Navigation class taught them how to read maps, calculate headings, compensate for wind drift, use radio beacons. They learned to navigate by pilotage. That meant following landmarks on the ground. And by dead reckoning, that meant using time, speed, and direction to calculate position. They learned celestial navigation using the stars. They practiced with chart plotters, dividers, and circular slide rules called E6B flight computers. Meteorology class taught them how to read weather reports. They learned to understand frontal systems. They learned to recognize dangerous conditions like thunderstorms and icing. They learned about altimetry, how barometric pressure affects altitude readings. They learned about visibility, cloud ceilings, crosswinds. And here's something critical you need to understand. Weather could kill a pilot faster than enemy fire. The women needed to understand it inside and out. Aircraft recognition was critical. The women needed to be able to identify any aircraft they might encounter, American or enemy, in a fraction of a second. They studied silhouettes, wing shapes, engine configurations. They practiced with flashcards until they could name any aircraft from any angle instantly. Mechanics class taught them how an aircraft engine works. Reciprocating engines, ignition systems, fuel systems, hydraulics, electrical systems. If something went wrong in flight, the women needed to understand what was happening and how to fix it, or at least how to keep flying long enough to land safely. After ground school, physical fitness training, calisthenics, running, push-ups, sit-ups. The women needed upper body strength to handle heavy aircraft. Some military planes had controls that required serious muscle to operate, especially at high speeds. The Army wanted to make sure the women were physically capable. Then came what they'd all been waiting for. Then came flight training. This was what they'd all come for. The reason they'd applied. The reason they'd left their homes and families. The chance to fly military aircraft. The training was divided into stages: primary, basic, advanced. Each stage lasted several weeks and covered different aircraft and skills. Primary training used the PT-19 Fairchild, open cockpit, fixed landing gear, radial engine, top speed about 130 miles per hour. Simple and forgiving, perfect for learning the fundamentals. The women practiced basic maneuvers, takeoffs and landings, turns, climbs, descents, stalls and spins, emergency procedures. They flew solo after just a few hours of instruction. Then they built up their hours with cross-country flights. They learned to navigate from one airfield to another using only their maps and compasses. At the end of primary training, they had to pass a check ride with an Army instructor. He'd take them up and put them through every maneuver they've learned. If they passed, they moved on to basic training. If they failed, they washed out. No second chances. Basic training used the BT-13 Multivaliant. The women quickly nicknamed it the Multivibrator because it shook constantly in flight. Enclosed cockpit, retractable landing gear, more powerful engine, faster and less forgiving than the PT-19. This was where things got serious. The BT-13 required more skill to fly. The landing gear had to be retracted and extended manually using a hand crank. The controls were heavier. The stall characteristics were trickier. A pilot who got sloppy in the BT-13 could end up in a spin or worse. The women practiced instrument flying. They learned to control the aircraft using only the instruments in the cockpit, no outside references. They flew under a hood, a canvas cover that blocked their view of the horizon. This simulated flying in clouds or at night. They practiced time turns, climbs, descents, holding altitude, and heading precisely. Instrument flying was one of the hardest skills to master, but it was absolutely essential for military pilots. They also spent hours in the Link Trainer. This was a ground-based flight simulator that looked like a small aircraft fuselage mounted on a swivel base. Trainees climbed inside, closed the hood, and flew, using instruments. An instructor outside manipulated the controls to simulate turbulence, wind, navigation problems. 50 hours in the Link Trainer was required. After basic training came another check ride. Pass and move on to advanced training. Fail and go home. Advanced training used the AT-6 Texan. This was a powerful single-seat aircraft that gave trainees their first taste of high-performance flying. 600 horsepower, retractable landing gear, variable pitch propeller, top speed over 200 miles per hour. The AT-6 was fast, loud, and demanding. It required precise control inputs and quick decision-making. It was the closest thing to a fighter plane that the trainees would fly during training. In the AT-6, the women practiced aerobatics, loops rolls, spins, snap rolls, Cuban 8s. They practiced formation flying, learning to fly wingtip to wingtip with other aircraft. They practiced gunnery, shooting at ground targets from a moving aircraft. They practiced night flying, taking off and landing in darkness. By the time a woman graduated from the WASP program, she had logged over 200 flight hours in multiple aircraft types. She could navigate cross-country in any weather. She could fly on instruments. She could handle emergencies. She was ready to fly any aircraft the Army Air Forces put in front of her. But the training wasn't just about flying. It was also about military discipline, even though the WASP were technically civilians. The women marched everywhere. Formation drills in the Texas heat. They saluted officers. They stood at attention during inspections. They followed orders without question. They learned military protocol, how to address superior officers, how to file reports, how to operate within a military command structure. They wore unofficial uniforms that they had to buy with their own money. Santiago blue flight suits, leather flight jackets, garrison caps. And here's something that might surprise you. They were required to wear lipstick at all times. Jackie Cochran insisted on it. She believed the women needed to maintain their femininity even while doing traditionally male work. So the rule was no climbing out of a cockpit without lipstick on. Some women found it empowering. Others found it ridiculous. But everyone followed the rule. The women earned $150 per month during training, plus room and board. After graduation, pay increased to $250 per month, later raised to $380. For comparison, male Army pilots earned significantly more and received full military benefits, housing allowances, and medical care. The WASP got none of that. If a woman got injured during training, she had to pay her own medical bills. If she got sick, same thing. There was no military health care for civilians. Some women went broke paying for broken bones or emergency surgery after crashes. And here's the part that should make your blood boil. If a woman lost her life during training, her family received nothing from the government. The other WASP would take up a collection. They'd pass a hat around. They'd scrape together enough money to ship the body home and pay for a funeral. 11 women perished during training at Avenger Field. Crashes during takeoff or landing. Mid-air collisions. Mechanical failures. Pilot error. Every loss was devastating. The women would gather for a memorial service. Then they get back in their planes the next day and keep flying. Life at Avenger Field wasn't all work and no play. Despite the demanding schedule and the constant pressure, the women found ways to create community. They threw parties in the barracks when they could sneak past curfew. They sang songs. They gave each other nicknames. They pulled pranks on the instructors and on each other. They had a mascot, a cartoon character named Fifinella, drawn by Walt Disney Studios specifically for the WASP. Fifinella was a female gremlin with wings, goggles, and a mischievous grin. The women painted her on the sides of their aircraft. They wore patches with her image on their flight suits. She became a symbol of their esprit de corps, their shared identity as women who flew. They also had songs. The most famous was a parody of the popular song, "I Want to Be a Cowboy's Sweetheart." The WASP version went, "I want to be a WASP pilot. I want to fly the AT-6. I want to spin and loop and roll, just like the fighter pilots do." They sang it in the barracks. They sang it on marches. They sang it to boost morale when someone washed out or when the homesickness became too much to bear. Because here's something you need to understand. Homesickness was real. Many of these women had never been away from home before. They missed their families. They missed their boyfriends and husbands. They missed home cooking and soft beds and privacy. Some cried themselves to sleep at night. Some wrote letters home every single day. They poured out their loneliness and fear and determination. But they stayed. They pushed through. Why? Because they wanted to fly. Because they believed in the mission. Because they knew that if they quit, they'd regret it for the rest of their lives. The instructors at Avenger Field were all men. Army pilots who'd been assigned to train the WASP. Some of them were skeptical at first. They didn't think women could handle military aircraft. They expected the women to cry, to complain, to wash out in droves. But most of the instructors came around quickly. They saw that the women were serious, that they studied hard, that they practiced until they got it right, that they didn't make excuses or ask for special treatment. One instructor later recalled that the WASP trainees were some of the best students he'd ever taught. They listened. They followed instructions. They asked intelligent questions, and they had a hunger to learn that was rare, even among the male cadets. But here's the reality they faced. There were still barriers, still skepticism, still discrimination. The women couldn't eat in the officers' mess. They had to eat in a separate section of the regular mess hall. They couldn't use the officers' club. They couldn't participate in certain base activities that were reserved for military personnel. And they had to deal with constant reminders that they were civilians, not military. They wore uniforms, but they weren't official military uniforms. They followed military discipline, but they had no rank. They flew military aircraft, but they couldn't be buried in military cemeteries if they perished. This civilian status would become one of the most controversial aspects of the WASP program. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, there were repeated efforts to militarize the WASP, to give them official military status, ranks, and benefits. Jackie Cochran lobbied hard for it. General Hap Arnold supported it. Many members of Congress supported it. In June of 1944, a bill came before the House of Representatives. This bill would have granted the WASP full military status. The bill failed. It was voted down 288 to 169. Now let me explain why this happened. Why? Several reasons. By mid-1944, the war in Europe was going well. D-Day had been a success. Allied forces were pushing into France. It was clear that Germany was going to lose. The demand for pilots was decreasing. Male pilots who'd been training for combat duty suddenly found themselves without assignments. They looked around and saw women flying planes, and they were furious. They lobbied Congress. They wrote letters to newspapers. They argued that women were taking jobs away from men. There was also a smear campaign. Rumors spread that the WASP were promiscuous, that they were disrupting military discipline, that they were costing taxpayers too much money. None of these rumors were true, but they gained traction. The women at Avenger field heard about the bill's failure. They were devastated. They'd worked so hard. They'd proven themselves beyond any doubt. And Congress had still said no. But they didn't quit. They kept training. They kept flying. Because consider this. The job still needed to be done. American aircraft still needed to be ferried. Targets still needed to be towed. Test flights still needed to happen. Between July of 1943 and December of 1944, 18 classes graduated from Avenger Field. Each class had between 40 and 120 women. Each class had its own identity, its own camaraderie. The final class, Class 44, W10, graduated on December 7, 1944. Exactly 3 years after Pearl Harbor, 71 women received their silver wings that day. General Hap Arnold attended the ceremony and gave a speech. He told the graduates, "You and more than 900 of your sisters have shown that you can fly wingtip to wingtip with your brothers." If ever there was any doubt in anyone's mind that women can become skillful pilots, the WASP have dispelled that doubt. It was a powerful acknowledgement, but it was also bittersweet, because everyone at Avenger Field knew something. The WASP program was ending. In October of 1944, General Arnold had announced that the program would be deactivated effective December 20th, 1944. The women had 2 weeks left. 2 weeks to finish their assignments, turn in their gear, and go home. But before we get to the end, let me tell you what matters most. We need to talk about what these 1,102 women actually accomplished during their time in service. Because that's where the real story is. That's where the 60 million miles were flown. Once a woman graduated from Avenger Field and earned her silver wings, she received orders. A base assignment, an aircraft type she'd be flying, a commanding officer she'd report to. WASP were stationed at 120 different air bases across the United States: California, Texas, Montana, Delaware, Florida, New York. Wherever the Army Air Forces needed pilots, the WASP went. The missions fell into several categories: ferry duty, test flights, target towing, cargo transport, engineering test flights, radar calibration, simulated strafing missions, administrative flights, training flights for male cadets. Let me start with the most important mission. Ferry duty was the backbone, the most common assignment, the reason Nancy Love had pitched the program in the first place. American factories were producing aircraft at a staggering rate, thousands of planes every month. Fighters, bombers, trainers, transport planes, Every one of those planes had to get from the factory to a military base somewhere in the United States. And many of them had to get from those bases to ports on the east or west coast. From there, they'd be loaded onto cargo ships and sent overseas to combat zones. Before the WASP, male pilots handled all of those ferry missions. But male pilots were desperately needed for combat duty, so the WASP stepped in. They became the primary ferry pilots for the domestic United States. Here's how the process worked. The process worked like this. A WASP pilot would receive orders to report to a specific factory or air base. She'd travel there by train or military transport. She'd check in with the commanding officer, receive her paperwork, and be assigned an aircraft. Then she'd inspect the plane, walk around it, check the tires, the propeller, the wings, the control surfaces. Look for anything obviously wrong. Leaks, damage, anything that might cause a problem in flight. She'd climb into the cockpit, check the instruments, make sure the fuel tanks were full, make sure the radio worked, make sure she had maps and navigation tools. Then she'd start the engine, run through the pre-flight checklist, get clearance from the tower, taxi to the runway, and take off alone. Ferry missions could be short or long, 100 miles or 2,000 miles, a few hours or several days. It depended on the aircraft type, the destination, the weather, and the range of the plane. For a long-distance ferry mission, say from California to New Jersey, a WASP pilot might fly 800 miles the first day. She'd land at a base in Arizona or New Mexico, refuel, stay overnight in whatever lodging was available, then get up the next morning and fly another 800 miles. Repeat that for 3 or 4 days until she reached her destination. Now imagine doing this without modern technology. Navigation was done by pilotage and dead reckoning, looking out the window, following landmarks on the ground, rivers, roads, railroad tracks, towns, mountains, comparing what she saw to what was on her map, calculating her speed, heading, and wind drift to estimate her position. There was radio communication with air traffic control at major bases, but for most of the flight, the pilot was on her own. No GPS, no autopilot, no radar, just her eyes, her map, and her skill. Weather was a constant challenge. Thunderstorms, icing, low visibility, strong winds. A pilot had to decide whether to fly through it, fly around it, or land and wait it out. The wrong decision could be life-threatening. Mechanical problems were another risk. These were brand new aircraft, fresh off the assembly line. Sometimes there were defects. Sometimes something hadn't been installed correctly. Sometimes an engine would overheat or a fuel line would leak or an instrument would fail. WASP pilots dealt with all of it. They'd nurse a sick engine to the nearest base. They'd land in a farmer's field if they had to. They'd troubleshoot problems in flight. They used their knowledge of aircraft mechanics to figure out what was wrong and how to fix it or compensate for it. Let me tell you about one close call. Teresa James, one of the original WFES pilots, once ferried a P-47 Thunderbolt from the Republic factory in Farmingdale, New York to Newark, New Jersey. It should have been a simple flight, less than an hour, but shortly after takeoff, the engine started running rough. The oil pressure was dropping. The temperature was rising. Teresa had a choice. Try to make it to Newark, which was still 30 miles away, or turn back to Farmingdale, which was now 15 miles behind her. She decided to push forward. She reduced power to ease the strain on the engine. She watched the instruments like a hawk, and she prayed. She made it to Newark with seconds to spare. The engine was smoking. The oil pressure was in the red. She landed, taxied to the apron, and shut down the engine. When mechanics inspected it, They found that a critical component had been installed incorrectly at the factory. If Teresa had pushed the engine any harder, it would have seized in flight. She would have had to bail out or crash. That was the kind of judgment call WASP pilots made every day. And they made the right call more often than not. Now consider these numbers. Between 1942 and December of 1944, WASP pilots buried 12,650 aircraft of 78 different types. 12,650 planes. Think about that. That's 34 planes every single day for 2.5 years. Delivered safely from factories to bases to ports. Ready for combat duty overseas. The aircraft ranged from small primary trainers like the PT-19. That plane weighed 2,000 pounds and had a top speed of 100 miles per hour, all the way up to massive four-engine bombers like the B-29 Super Fortress. That monster weighed 70,000 pounds fully loaded and could fly at 350 miles per hour. The WASP flew pursuit fighters like the P-38 Lightning, P-39 Air Cobra, P-40 Warhawk, P-47 Thunderbolt, and P-51 Mustang. They flew medium bombers like the B-25 Mitchell and B-26 Marauder. They flew heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator. They flew transports like the C-47 Skitran and C-54 Skymaster. They flew trainers, reconnaissance planes, cargo planes, liaison aircraft. 78 different types. Each one with its own quirks, its own handling characteristics, its own performance envelope. The women had to learn them all, had to adapt to each one, had to fly them safely regardless of experience level. Some aircraft were easy, forgiving, predictable. Others were notorious for being difficult or dangerous. The P-39 Air Cobra had a tendency to tumble into a flat spin if the pilot wasn't careful. The B-26 Marauder had such a high stall speed and unforgiving handling characteristics that male pilots called it the Widowmaker. The A-26 Invader was fast and powerful but heavy on the controls. The WASP flew them all. And they did it with lower accident rates than their male counterparts in many cases. But ferry duty was just one part of what the WASP did. There was also target towing. And target towing was arguably the most dangerous mission type. Picture what this mission involved. Target towing missions worked like this. A WASP pilot would take off in an aircraft, usually an A-24 Banshee or an A-25 Helldiver. A long cable was attached to the tail. At the end of that cable, 1,500 feet behind the plane, was a fabric sleeve or banner. That banner was the target. The pilot would fly over a gunnery range at a specific altitude and speed. On the ground below, or sometimes in the air from other aircraft, gunners would practice shooting at the target with live ammunition. Real bullets, real anti-aircraft guns. Real tracer rounds that glowed bright as they arced through the sky. The gunners were supposed to aim at the banner trailing behind the plane, not at the plane itself. But gunners make mistakes. Trainees especially. They'd misjudge the lead. They'd fire too early or too late. And sometimes, the rounds hit the plane instead of the target. Multiple WASP pilots came back from target towing missions with bullet holes in their aircraft. Rounds through the wings, through the fuselage, through the tail section. In some cases, bullets passed within inches of where the pilot was sitting. And here's what makes this even more remarkable. There was nothing the pilot could do except maintain her heading and altitude. Keep the target steady. Let the gunners finish their practice. Then land and hope the damage wasn't too severe. Why did the WASP do target towing instead of male pilots? Because the Army Air Forces needed male pilots for combat. Target towing was considered a non-combat support role. Dangerous, yes, but not as dangerous as flying over Germany or Japan. So it was deemed acceptable for women. The WASP saw it differently. They knew how critical gunnery training was. If the gunners didn't get enough practice, they wouldn't be effective in combat. They'd miss enemy planes. They'd get shot down. The WASP were helping save lives by making sure those gunners knew how to shoot accurately. So they kept flying those missions, kept towing those targets, kept putting themselves in harm's way so that male gunners could learn to hit what they were aiming at. Now let me tell you about the most nerve-wracking missions. Then there were the test flights. Test flights might have been the most nerve-wracking mission category of all. When an aircraft came back from a combat zone damaged, or when a plane came out of a repair depot after being fixed, someone had to fly it to make sure it was safe. Someone had to take that plane up, put it through its paces, and see if the repairs actually worked. Male pilots hated this assignment. They called it extremely dangerous duty. Here's why. Because if the mechanics had made a mistake, if they'd missed something or installed a part incorrectly, the test pilot would be the one to discover it, usually at the worst possible moment, at altitude, at speed, when there was no margin for error. For a long time, male combat pilots refused test flight assignments. They'd trained to fly combat missions, not to risk their lives testing planes that might fall apart mid-flight. They saw it as beneath them, as a waste of their skills. The WASP stepped in. They became the primary test pilots for repaired aircraft at bases across the country. They flew planes that had been shot full of holes over Germany, patched up by mechanics, and deemed ready for service. They flew planes that had crash-landed and been rebuilt. They flew planes with new engines, new hydraulic systems, new electrical components. Consider this remarkable achievement. One WASP named and Baumgartner became the first American woman to fly a jet aircraft. In October of 1944, she flew the Bell P-51, an experimental jet fighter, at Wright Field in Ohio. The P-51 was cutting-edge technology, revolutionary, and dangerous. Male pilots were hesitant to fly it, and volunteered. She took it up. She flew it through a series of test maneuvers, and she brought it back safely. Dora Doherty Struther flew test missions on aircraft that had been damaged in combat. She'd take a plane that had been shot up over France or Italy, repaired, and sent back to the States for evaluation. She'd run it through dive tests, stall tests, maximum speed runs. She pushed those planes to their limits to make sure they were safe for other pilots to fly. Now here's a story that shows you what these women were made of. On one test flight, Dora's engine quit at 8,000 feet. No power. No way to restart it. She had to glide the plane down and execute a dead-stick landing. That means she landed without engine power. She lined up her approach perfectly, judged her glide path, touched down smooth as silk, walked away without a scratch. The mechanics figured out the problem, fixed it, and she flew the plane again the next day. That was the mentality. Something goes wrong, deal with it. Don't complain. Don't ask for sympathy. Just do the job. And then there was the B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced, most expensive, most complicated bomber the United States had ever built. For radar, 3350 engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, a pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, the ability to carry 10 tons of bombs and fly missions halfway across the Pacific Ocean. The B-29 also had a reputation for being difficult and dangerous. The engines had a tendency to overheat and catch fire. The controls were heavy. They required significant physical strength to operate. The plane was enormous, weighing over 70,000 pounds fully loaded. Male pilots were intimidated by it. Some flatly refused B-29 assignments. In 1944, the Army Air Forces had a problem. They needed pilots for the B-29 program. The bombers were being built by the hundreds for the strategic bombing campaign against Japan. But male pilots kept refusing assignments because they'd heard the plane was too hard to handle. Someone came up with an idea. What if women flew the B-29? If women could handle it, male pilots would have no excuse. They'd be embarrassed into accepting the assignments. 2 WASP pilots were selected for a special demonstration. Dora Doherty and Dorothea Johnson Mormon. Both were experienced pilots with thousands of hours. Both were calm under pressure. Both were exceptionally skilled. They were given a brief checkout flight in the B-29. Just enough instruction to learn the basics. Where the controls were. How the engines responded. How to handle takeoff and landing. Then they were told to fly it in front of an audience. Male pilots. Commanding officers. Skeptics who didn't believe women could handle the biggest bomber in the American arsenal. Picture this scene. Dora and Dorothea climbed into the cockpit. They ran through the pre-flight checklist. They started all 4 engines. The sound was deafening. The whole aircraft vibrated with power. They taxied out to the runway, released the brakes, opened the throttles. The B-29 accelerated down the runway, picking up speed and lifted into the sky. They flew the bomber through a full demonstration. Turns, climbs, descents. They brought it in for a touch-and-go landing. They touched the wheels to the runway and then powered back into the air. They did it again and again. Smooth, controlled, professional. The male pilots watching were stunned. If 2 women could fly the B-29 with such ease, then clearly the plane wasn't as impossible as they'd been claiming. From that day forward, male pilots stopped refusing B-29 assignments. Nobody wanted to be shown up by women. Nobody wanted to admit they couldn't handle something that women had handled effortlessly. Think about what this means. Dora Doherty and Dorothea Johnson had just embarrassed hundreds of male pilots into doing their jobs. And it worked perfectly. By the summer of 1944, the WASP were at their peak. Over 900 women were actively flying missions. They were based at 120 different air stations. They'd proven themselves beyond any reasonable doubt. They'd flown safely. They'd flown competently. They'd done everything the Army Air Forces had asked of them and more. And then everything changed. The war in Europe was going well. D-Day had been a success on June 6, 1944. Allied forces had landed in Normandy and were pushing inland. Paris would be liberated in August. By fall, it was clear that Germany was going to lose. It was just a matter of time. As the war wound down, the Army Air Forces needed fewer pilots. Male pilots who'd been training for combat assignments suddenly found themselves without jobs. They looked around and saw women flying planes. They were furious. Male pilots started lobbying Congress. They wrote letters to newspapers. They argued that women were taking jobs away from men, that the country didn't need the WASP anymore, that the program was a waste of taxpayer money. There was also a smear campaign. Rumors spread that the WASP were sexually promiscuous, that they were disrupting military discipline, that they were costing too much. None of these rumors were true, but they gained traction in the media. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, there had been efforts to militarize the WASP, to give them official military status, ranks, and benefits. Jackie Cochran lobbied for it constantly. General Hap Arnold supported it. Many members of Congress supported it. In June of 1944, a bill came before the House of Representatives. The bill would have granted the WASP full military status. It would have made them second lieutenants in the Army Air Forces. It would have given them military pay, housing allowances, medical care, and veterans' benefits. On June 21, 1944, the House voted on the bill. It failed. 288 votes against, 169 votes in favor. The WASP would remain civilians. No military status, no benefits, no recognition. General Arnold watched the political situation deteriorate. He saw the writing on the wall. With the war winding down and political opposition mounting, he knew the WASP program couldn't continue. On August 5, 1944, Arnold announced that the current class of trainees at Avenger Field would be the last. No more recruiting. No more training. The WASP program would end on December 20th, 1944. The women were devastated. They'd worked so hard. They'd proven themselves. 38 of them had lost their lives. And now they were being told to pack up and go home. On December 7th, 1944, exactly 3 years after Pearl Harbor, the final WASP training class graduated at Avenger Field. 71 women received their silver wings. General Hap Arnold attended the ceremony. He stood before them and said words that would echo for decades. You and more than 900 of your sisters have shown that you can fly wingtip to wingtip with your brothers. If ever there was any doubt in anyone's mind that women can become skillful pilots, the WASP have dispelled that doubt. It was a powerful acknowledgement. But it came with a bitter edge, because 13 days later, on December 20th, the WASP program officially ended. 915 women pilots were on active duty when the program shut down. They were told to turn in their gear, pack their bags, go home. Some were allowed to fly on military transport aircraft back to their home states if space was available. Others had to pay their own way. Train tickets, bus tickets, whatever they could afford. And here's what should infuriate you. There was no ceremony, no thank you from Congress, no veterans benefits, no GI Bill to help them go back to school or find jobs, no acknowledgement that they'd just spent 2 years serving their country. General Arnold ordered commanding officers to issue the women certificates similar to honorable discharges. But those certificates had no legal standing. They were just pieces of paper. The women went home, back to their towns and cities, back to their families. And they were told explicitly to stay quiet. Don't talk about what you did. Don't make a fuss. Just disappear. And for the most part, they did. They got married. They had children. They became teachers, nurses, secretaries. Some tried to stay in aviation. A few got jobs as flight instructors. But most airlines wouldn't hire them. Most employers didn't care that they'd flown military aircraft. The war was over. Women were supposed to go back to being housewives. Now let me tell you what happened after the war. For 33 years, the United States government acted like the Women Airforce Service Pilots had never existed. The WASP records were classified, sealed away in government archives, inaccessible to the public. The women themselves weren't allowed to talk about their service in any official capacity. They had no veteran status. They couldn't join veterans organizations. They couldn't march in Veterans Day parades. They couldn't be buried in military cemeteries. When they applied for jobs and listed their WASP service on their resumes, employers didn't believe them. Women flying military aircraft during World War II? That couldn't be true. The military didn't let women fly. These women must be lying or exaggerating. Some WASP stopped mentioning their service altogether. It was easier to just forget about it, to move on with their lives and pretend those 2 years had never happened. But they didn't forget. They couldn't forget. They'd lost 38 sisters. They'd flown 60 million miles. They'd served their country at a critical moment in history. And that doesn't just disappear. In the years immediately after the war, a few WASP tried to stay connected. They formed an organization called the Order of Fifinella, named after their mascot. They had reunions. They wrote letters to each other. They shared memories. But there was no official recognition, no government acknowledgement, just a group of women who'd done something extraordinary and been forgotten. The 1950s came and went. The 1960s. The women got older. Their children grew up. Some of them told their kids about their WASP service. Some didn't. Some families had no idea that their mother or grandmother had been a military pilot during the war. Then came the 1970s, and everything changed. In 1972, a journalist named Bird Howell Granger published a book. It was called On Final Approach: The Women Airforce Service Pilots of World War II. It was one of the first books to tell the full WASP story. It documented their training, their missions, their achievements, their losses, and it got attention. Around the same time, the United States Air Force announced that it would begin accepting women for pilot training. The media reported this as a historic first. The first time women would fly military aircraft for the United States. Imagine how the surviving WASP felt. The surviving WASP were furious. This wasn't a historic first. They'd been flying military aircraft 30 years earlier. 78 different types of aircraft. 60 million miles. And the Air Force and the media were acting like it had never happened. The women decided to fight back. They started organizing, writing letters, contacting members of Congress, demanding recognition, demanding that their service be acknowledged, demanding veteran status. One of their biggest allies was Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. Goldwater had been a ferry pilot himself during World War II. He knew what the WASP had done. He knew they deserved recognition. And he had the political power to make it happen. In 1977, Goldwater introduced legislation in Congress to grant the WASP retroactive military status, to recognize them as veterans of World War II, to give them access to veterans' benefits, including the right to be buried in military cemeteries. The bill faced opposition. Some veterans groups argued that the WASP had been civilians, not military. They said giving them veteran status would set a dangerous precedent. Some members of Congress still didn't believe women belonged in military aviation. But this time, the WASP had momentum. They had public support. They had documentation of their service. They had the backing of influential senators like Goldwater. On November 23, 1977, President Jimmy Carter signed the GI Bill Improvement Act into law. Buried in that legislation was a provision that officially recognized the WASP as veterans of World War II. 33 years after they'd been sent home. 33 years after they'd been told to disappear. The United States government finally acknowledged what the WASP had done. The surviving WASP could now join veterans organizations. They could receive military burials. They could apply for veterans' benefits. They could tell their stories and be believed. But recognition was one thing. Honoring their service properly was another. The WASP kept pushing. They wanted more than just veteran status. They wanted the country to understand the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. They wanted younger generations to know their story. In 2009, Congress voted to award the Women Airforce Service Pilots the Congressional Gold Medal. That's one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. Only a few hundred individuals and organizations had ever received it. George Washington, the Wright brothers, Winston Churchill, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and now the WASP. On March 10, 2010, roughly 200 surviving WASP gathered at the United States Capitol for the ceremony. They were in their 80s and 90s by then. Many used wheelchairs or walkers. Some were blind. Some were deaf. But they were there. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi presented the medal. She said, "The WASP were pioneers who broke the bonds of gravity and shattered societal expectations. They proved that women could fly military aircraft. They freed thousands of male pilots for combat duty. They served their country with skill, courage, and determination. And today, 65 years after their service ended, we finally give them the recognition they deserve." President Barack Obama had signed the bill authorizing the medal the previous year. In his remarks, he said the WASP had shown extraordinary bravery and patriotism, that they'd paved the way for every woman who'd served in the military since, that their legacy was immeasurable. The 200 WASP at the ceremony wept. They applauded. They hugged each other. 65 years. It had taken 65 years for their country to say thank you properly. Now consider the lasting impact of what these women did. The impact of the WASP goes far beyond their wartime service. They fundamentally changed what was possible for women in military aviation. In 1976, the United States Air Force Academy admitted its first class of female cadets. 10 women enrolled. Graduated 4 years later. Today, women make up over 20% of each incoming class. In 1977, the same year the WASP gained veteran status, the Air Force began training its first female pilots since the WASP program ended. 10 women entered pilot training. All 10 graduated. They flew transports and tankers, non-combat aircraft. In 1993, Congress repealed the Combat Exclusion Law. This law had prevented women from flying combat missions. For the first time since World War II, women could officially fly fighters and bombers in combat. In 1994, Lieutenant Jeannie Flynn became the first woman to qualify as an F-15 Eagle fighter pilot. In 1999, Lieutenant Colonel Eileen Collins became the first woman to command a space shuttle mission. In 2001, women flew combat missions over Afghanistan and Iraq. They flew F-16 Fighting Falcons, A-10 Warthogs, F/A-18 Hornets. They dropped bombs on enemy positions. They provided close air support for ground troops. They flew reconnaissance missions deep into hostile territory. In 2015, the Pentagon announced that all combat roles would be open to women. This included special operations and ground combat units. Every job in the military. No exceptions. In 2019, the first female F-35 Lightning II pilot completed training. The F-35 is the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. Stealth. Supersonic. Capable of engaging targets on the ground and in the air. Here's where we are today. Today, women make up approximately 7% of military pilots in the United States. It's still a small percentage, but it's growing. And every single one of those women stands on the shoulders of the WASP. Of those 1,102 women who flew 60 million miles between 1942 and 1944, every woman who climbs into a cockpit and serves her country owes a debt to Jacqueline Cochran and Nancy Harkness Love. They fought to create the program. To Betty Gillies and Teresa James and the original WFES pilots who proved it could work. To the 1,830 women who went through training at Avenger Field. To the 1,102 who graduated. And especially to the 38 who perished. The 38 who gave their lives flying for a country that wouldn't even acknowledge their service for 3 decades. Their names deserve to be remembered. Cornelia Ford, lost in a mid-air collision in Texas. Margaret Oldenburg, lost in a crash in California. Mabel Rawlinson, lost during a training flight in Texas. Jane Champlin, lost while ferrying an aircraft in Nebraska. 34 more names. 34 more women who perished doing what they loved. Serving their country. Flying. For decades, their story was buried. Classified. Forgotten. The government didn't want to talk about them. Historians overlooked them. Textbooks ignored them. But now we know. Now we remember. And now we honor them. So let me leave you with this. The Women Airforce Service Pilots flew 60 million miles in the shadows. They broke every barrier the military establishment could throw at them. They faced discrimination, skepticism, and danger at every turn. They lost 38 of their sisters. They were sent home without thanks. They were told to stay quiet and disappear. But they didn't disappear. They persevered. They fought for recognition. They told their stories. They made sure that future generations would know what they accomplished. And because of them, women fly today. Women command fighter squadrons. Women fly combat missions over hostile territory. Women test experimental aircraft. Women command space missions. Women lead, serve, and excel in roles that would have been unthinkable without the WASP. The women who flew 60 million miles, who ferried 78 different types of aircraft, who towed targets while gunners shot at them, who tested planes that might fall apart in mid-flight, who flew the B-29 Super Fortress just to prove it could be done. These are the women who changed everything. The women who changed aviation history, who changed military history, who changed what it means to serve your country. The Women Airforce Service Pilots, the WASP, the unsung heroines who flew in the shadows and changed the world.